The Central Club.
Okay, then. Well, I would say, can we just dive in on the night of the event? But this was something that you say happened days before. You know, there was something in the air. I think the first thing we need to do is talk about the event.
Okay, well, I'll start at the beginning. It actually started for me on the Tuesday, and it was my neighbour David that first noticed this very small grey twin-prop plane just flying very low and very slow over my village, which is Penturk. I didn't pay it any mind. We got RAF St. Athan 14 miles away, and we have military aircraft that pass through quite regularly, but none of them seemed to stick around and stay. Wednesday morning was when we really started to pay attention to these aircraft. And David had come out of his house and he was cursing because this small aircraft had kept him awake all night. And as you can appreciate, Penturk is extremely quiet at night. And so anything like that, a small prop plane flying very low over your house is extremely loud and very annoying. So all Wednesday night, I had a very restless night. Now, David had written to the Ministry of Defence and they did not reply. He'd also written to Wells Online, and they did not reply either. So when you've eliminated everything else, it was quite clear that they were watching for something. These two aircraft, one at a time, by the way, would bunny hop with each other when they changed shifts to go off and refuel. And then they would stay for another 8 hours or so, and then the other plane would come back and take its place. Well, we decided that if it was still there Thursday night, that we would go out and watch with them, because clearly they were watching for something. No exercises were listed, no NOTAMs were posted, and certainly when they closed the entire Welsh airspace, it drew our attention that something was really going on. Now, David had said that perhaps they were watching for Russian planes again, because it was only the week before that we turned away two Tu-160 bombers, Russian bombers, from our airspace. We'd lit the fire pit at the back of my garden. We stood there and we watched this small grey propeller plane that had gone from flying in circles to flying in figure of 8 patterns over the top of my house, roughly every 7 minutes. And it got to about 2 a.m. and I said to David, it's freezing. I'm going to go in. Nothing's happening. Bit bored, to be honest, you know. And I just got to my back door and I just placed my hand on the back door handle and I heard what sounded like a missile coming. And I ran to the back of my garden to see this huge plane go over the top. We had almost a full moon. It just ebbed over the full moon. And as it banked around to the left-hand side, so you could see this mushroom-shaped object on its back, and David exclaimed, "That's an E3 Sentry plane." Well, that meant absolutely nothing to me back then. All I knew was just about identify a Cessna, if I was lucky, you know. I know an awful lot more now because of the meticulous, in-depth military timeline that Gary Jones, the investigator, has put together. Because this plane had turned up, we decided we'd watch a little longer. And you can see in every direction but north in Penturk, because that's where the actual mountain is, for a good 14 miles on a clear day. And this plane started to circle, not small circles, big circles. And we estimate it took a few minutes for it to go around just once. And 7 times this plane circled. David said perhaps it's taxiing for the airport. The only airport large enough to accommodate a plane of that size would have been Cardiff International, where you wouldn't expect to see an E3 Sentry plane. This was a NATO plane, not RAF. The 7th time it went around, one red light became visible high above the trees, above the fields behind my house. There's nothing behind my house except farmland that ebbs away from you. And I'd called for Donna, one of our other neighbours who'd been watching with us that night, and she'd gone in to make us all hot drinks. I called a second time, didn't get an answer. So I said to David, come on, and we ran, jumped over the small wire fence and ran to the 5-bar gate that overlooks the farmland behind my house to get an unobstructed view as to what was going on. The E3 Sentry was still above us. At this point now, flying in an oval flight pattern, flying out towards Llantrisant, about 5 miles away, turning and coming back. And one red light was followed by 2 more that formed a triangle shape. and the nearest set of lights on its underside were brighter than the rest. And slowly but surely it emerged out of the darkness. This thing did not come down from outer space. This thing came through the space. And the nearest set of lights flying in horizontally, point first, turning very slowly anti-clockwise, and as it did so, came down in a pendulum motion, the leading set of lights still brighter than the rest. I remember as it went past the trees, it looked like train carriages, with the lights behind the silhouetted black trees. And I stood on the 5-bar gate to get a better look through the bare trees. When it was in the upright position, it's fired this really bright green object out of the top. And I didn't know until recently what shape that was because it was too bright. It's moved across to my left-hand side and above the trees and just rocked there, backwards and forwards gently, almost surveying the area. The pyramid, meanwhile, the 3-sided pyramid, is listed to the right-hand side, but still moving anti-clockwise away from us. And as it neared the ground, I said to David, it's landing, thinking it was coming down. When in reality, the ground there rises and it is the foot of the Garth Mountain. So the land was coming up to meet it. And it ejected this hand I described like a hand of lightning. Not thin lightning like we have here, thick, fire-coloured lightning. And the whole thing lit up really brightly. And around the brightest lights, you could see that this was a solid craft and not a string of lights. I heard the military planes coming. I now know to be 2 C-17s, huge aircraft with 2 engines on each wing. And they were flying wingtip to wingtip. And I looked up just to see them go over the top of me. And when I looked back, I couldn't see the pyramid anymore. That's not to say it wasn't there. I just couldn't see it because there's no light pollution there. It's pitch black. And the green object that had been there the whole time had moved across and in front of these aircraft. 2 further aircraft have come from my left-hand side. I now know to be 2 C-130 Hercules aircraft. And they've gone back in behind the 2 C-17s. So you've got the C-17s in close and the C-130s out wide. And between them, they took up the entire visible airspace. The green object has now fired 3 really bright strobes at these aircraft, I think in an attempt to get their attention, to get them to follow it. And that's exactly what we did. And it seemed to get excited somehow. And it skipped, I described, like Tigger on Winnie the Pooh. It skipped and bobbed away into the distance with the 4 aircraft behind it. The E-3 Sentry was still above us. And it bathed all of the aircraft in green light. And I watched it until I couldn't see it anymore. Whilst I was looking at the bottom of that pyramid, David was looking at the top. He said he saw 15 or 20, he described as orbs, come out of the top of this pyramid. And I didn't see any of them because I was fixated on it touching the ground. These things didn't make any noise at all. And after the green object had gone, we were approached by 2 barrel-shaped objects. They were capped on the top and on the bottom with just black caps. They were completely smooth on the outside. And all the insides were moving like white noise on a TV screen, but it was mixing in on itself like it was more 3D than that. And one of them, they were both red in colour, tail-light red, moved across and above the hedge to my left-hand side, about 20 feet away and about 20 feet up. And I stared at it just for a few seconds because I wanted the details. I wanted to see. And then I looked to see where the other one was, and that hadn't stopped. And by that time, that was right over the top of me. And the only thing I could think to do was to wave. With all the military activity going on, I didn't want us to appear to be hostile. And for me, that had to have been the universal signal for hello, and I don't mean you any harm. And the red barrel changed colour from tail-light red to traffic light green, and I could see even clearer the insides moving, mixing in on itself. And I did hear a man's voice, not my voice. Tell the world what you witnessed here. And I said, I will. That was the only thing. David and I were complete polar opposites to each other. After the barrels went in different directions, the red barrel that remained sentry the whole time over the hedge moved away to my left-hand side and low across the fields. And I watched that until I couldn't see it anymore. And the now green barrel has moved away to my right-hand side and above the rooftops of the houses. Now, David and I had moved down or walked down to the second field where this pyramid had come in because he said he saw 15 or 20 of these objects and we wanted to see if there were any more. Our phones didn't work. David's was completely fried. Mine, I knew was fully charged, was completely flat. And even though we had almost a full moon in the shadow of the hedgerows and the trees, the ground was pitch black and slippery, uneven. And this is a mountain in the middle of the night. When we got down to what we call the second gate, it was pitch black. There was nothing we could see. When we were walking back towards the first gate, we heard the helicopters coming. There were 3 Apache helicopters, one above 2, flying in a pyramid formation. You could see the red lights pulsing out in front of them, slowly pulsing. You could see all the grass and the hedgerows and everything being pushed flat by the force of their rotor blades. And they were moving from my left to my right on an interception course where that green object had gone, that first green object in the Llantrisant area. We watched them go across the fields and then ran around the front of the houses to get a better look up the valley, but by the time we got there, they were already out of sight. We went back to my house. David was catatonic, sat there staring into the abyss, trying to make sense of everything that had just happened. And I was the complete opposite. I was energized. I needed to tell someone, anyone that would know what to do about this, because I didn't know anyone in this alternative world, in this UFO community. I knew no one. David went home and I went to bed, not that I could sleep. And I heard this enormous explosion. This was not a bang. This was a kaboom from 5 miles away in the Llantrisant area. And I knew then they'd shot that green object down. I woke up the next morning with David hammering on my front door. And he burst through my door saying how Wells Online had put out this cover story of a military exercise. Well, I didn't know you weren't supposed to talk about UFOs. So I immediately launched into a comment that I can categorically state that that was no exercise. What they were chasing last night were not planes. I will take a lie detector for anyone, anywhere. But what I witnessed last night will stay with me for the rest of my life. And I did have 2 debunkers. One of them called themselves the Smoking Man, because they liked their little jokes, using a fake Facebook profile. And the other one called himself Agent Fox Mulder. And they tried to ridicule, LOL, good one. And I said, yeah, it was good, wasn't it? So you may have chased and shot down the green object, but you left all the others here, didn't you? So they fell silent very quickly because I don't think they wanted me to say any more. The same morning, Stephen, one of my friends, had come over to my house and we went over to what we called the near landing field where this hand of lightning came out of this craft, expecting to see burn marks on the ground. But everything was dead. All the grass, it seemed as if all the chlorophyll had been sucked out of it. And it was snowing just in the one field, not in the surrounding fields. I remembered standing on the edge like a child and watching the snow fall in front of me, but not on me. When I went back to my home, the comments on Wells Online had grown, and there were many people talking about the explosions in Llantrisant and over Llantrisant Common. And that was my starting point at the other end on the same day, because I wanted to find the impact crater. I wanted to know what had happened to this green object. So we went out to Llantrisant Common, and all of the metal that had been on the common for years, old washing machines, bits of old bike, that type of thing, had all been neatly picked up and stacked along the roadside. Clearly, there had been a meticulous metal search that had gone on in the early hours, or what the military call silent hours, in the middle of the night, using helicopters and troops on the ground. And there was yellow tape tied to bushes and trees, as if it was some kind of grid section, so they knew what areas had been searched. And I saw
was the yellow tape still
yes
intact, or was it ripped off? Or?
Oh no, it was still there.
Okay.
It's still tied to the trees. Same thing was in Smilog Woods too. But I'll get to that. I saw 2 people walking their dogs, and I approached them to ask them if they knew anything, bearing in mind, this is the morning after the night before. And they told me how the Chinooks had landed on Llantrisant Common, how troops and helicopters were on the ground, and how helicopters had circled using spotlights in the early hours of the morning. This is 4:30 in the morning. And they talked about the explosion, that the first explosion was an air explosion. And the second one sounded like something that hit the ground in Smilog Woods. Well, because I wasn't from the area, I didn't know where Smilog Woods was located. And I felt very stupid when they pointed to the huge 8-acre wooded hill that rises behind the Royal Glamorgan Hospital. But I decided there and then that I would go to Smilog Woods to find the impact crater. And because we knew the trajectory of the green object, it wasn't long before we found the beginnings of what we call the debris trail. All of the canopies, all of the trees have been hit out, and an ever-descending height into Smilog Woods. We fought our way through the brambles at the beginnings of the woods. Once you got into the woodland itself, nothing grows on the forest floor because no light penetrates that far. But it was still a hike to follow the debris trail as opposed to sticking to a road or, a walkway. And I was exhausted, and I said to Stephen, let's go back and tell the others what we'd found. And that's exactly what we did. Went back to my home. We hatched a plan then to go up at 9 o'clock the next morning with cameras to follow the debris trail through to its end and find the impact crater, which is what we did. And the morning of the 27th, my hair had turned completely white. Completely white. And that is visible in the crash site video that we took that day. We'd gone up to Smilog Woods. We'd followed the debris trail through. The canopies of the trees, that's how it started. The canopies were out, and then as you got further in, the trees were distended almost as if they tried to explode from the inside out, like they'd been affected by some kind of external energy. But the actual impact site, there were 6 60-foot trees, approximately 12 to 14 inches in diameter, trunk diameter, that had been snapped mid-trunk. An impossibility in nature. All at the same height with these burn marks on the surrounding trees. But the burn marks were white, not black. And a really pungent smell in the air, a bit like fireworks or burning rubber. And it was snowing at the crash site. Nowhere else. The sky was blue. Completely blue. Not a cloud in sight. After that, we went back to my home. I went out for my own curiosity, not because I thought there'd be a big investigation. But after I was lent on by the mainstream media, interrogated by the mainstream media, I stayed silent for 18 months. I didn't even go out my house for that amount of time.
Did you understand the size of this when you was going through, chasing the track trail and stuff? Did you realise how big this event was at the time?
No, to be honest, I didn't. And I always believed since that somebody somewhere in the world must have seen something like this. But to find out that no one had is quite shocking. But what I was more upset about, I think, was our response. That we'd set an ambush for this thing. That the military knew that it was coming. No attempt to communicate. No hand of friendship. They set an ambush, they pursued, and they shot it down without mercy.
Yeah, there's so much to unravel in all of this. And these are the two things that have stood in my mind is the worrying factor of them knowing, days before, circling like they're expecting something, and how quickly, they kind of eradicated all the evidence.
Well, they've tried, but I think Gary and I have caught them cold because I don't think an event of this size has ever happened in this country before. We've certainly caught them out lying on Freedom of Information requests. which is an offence under Section 77 of the Freedom of Information Act. And it seems that these people, like the Ministry of Defence, like South Wales Police and other agencies, have been able, over the years, to lie on a Freedom of Information request and not be held accountable.
Who do you think reported that to the Wales Online that it's a military exercise then? The military?
Well, this is something that we're trying to get to the bottom of. Clearly, the military were in at community level from the off. And what I mean by that is that there were certain individuals that were in the local hubs. So in Llantwit Major, Llantrisant, Pontyclun, all of them, just with the one-liner. It was a military exercise. No explanation.
Like Facebook posts and stuff, like community posts.
No explanation, no follow-up, no nothing. Making this comment before Wales Online knew that it was a military exercise, because it wasn't. There has to be a press briefing. The press didn't know. There must be a ministerial briefing. We've had a Freedom of Information request from the Welsh Government. They didn't know. Everything they're supposed to do for an exercise, they did not do. But we've recently, it's taken us 7 years, had it from the Secretariat himself, from the Ministry of Defence. There were no military exercises in February of 2016 in South Wales. That's a fact.